Welcome everyone to the National Liberal Club in London. I'm Val Stansfield. I'm chair of the Women's Network at the club. And tonight we have a joint event between the Women's Network and the Defence and Security Circle, one of our newer groups, but a very lively group. And in support of the Women's Network, we're marking not only International Women's Day on Monday, but we're having a week of events for International Women's Week, which we hope will recur every year from now on. Tonight we've got a fantastic panel of four women experts, women who have a voice and a standing in the field of digital regulation, facial recognition and privacy debates. This session will extend a little beyond our normal 60 minutes to allow for lots of questions and answers. Please note that this will be recorded and an edited version posted on the NLC YouTube channel this week sometime. If you want to ask a question, please send them to Sina, S-I-N-A, one of our co-hosts, into the chat box icon at the bottom of your screen, and he will manage the flow of questions to the panel. I'm thrilled that the Defence and Security Circle has an active membership and audience that is more than 1/3 female, something few expected so early in its life. I'll pass you on to Daniel Cope, one of the two vice chairs of the Defence and Security Circle. He will be interlocutor for the evening, and then later Jennifer Schwarzenberg will give a vote of thanks from the circles. Collaboration between the groups is at the heart of the National Liberal Club. And part of our vision. So bringing together people online in the near future, the Face-to-Face Club is something we intend to continue, and hopefully we'll see you all again at some time in the future. Over to you, Dan.
Thank you, Val, for that very welcome introduction. And it's my great pleasure and delight to welcome you all to our panel today. We have some extraordinary women across the industry. My name is Daniel Cope, as introduced by Val. I'm the co-vice chairman of the Defence and Security Circle. I've worked in the data management industry for around 10 years, and I actually practice data privacy, data protection, and other aspects of data management on a day-to-day basis. And so it is without further ado and great pleasure that I introduce my panel. It does go without saying, but note that we are all speaking within our personal, not our professional capacity. Therefore, please do note all of these comments are of our personal views, not that of any organisation which we may be affiliated or work with. Therefore, please do take that into regard when considering these points. Further, none of the information here should be taken as legal advice. This is for general purpose only. Therefore, do take that in consideration when considering any of this information for implementation. Without further ado, I will introduce my panel. We have Emma Martins, the Commissioner for Guernsey. Emma, would you like to introduce yourself?
Thank you very much, Daniel. Thank you so much for the invitation today. So I'm Emma Martins, and I'm the Data Protection Commissioner for the Bailiwick of Guernsey. I'm not sure if anyone's been there, but it's part of the Channel Islands, quite near France, not too far from the UK. So my role is, it does what it says on the tin. We are the regulatory office, the independent regulatory office for the data protection law, which is very similar to the GDPR, which I'm sure some of you may be familiar with. So our job is to implement that, to enforce that, but we have a wider remit in terms of encouraging a conversation, a narrative around the good use of data. So thank you very much for the opportunity to contribute today.
Thank you, Emma. And Helen, would you like to give an introduction to yourself?
Okay, I'm Hellen Beveridge. I am an independent data privacy and data protection consultant. My key areas of interest are technoethics and the ethical use of data. I work a lot with SMEs and associations and not-for-profits, where I am, I'm going to say the adult in the room, but I am the voice of the data subjects within organisations, looking at and how they use their data, look after their data, and keep themselves on the right side of the law. Working predominantly at the moment at trying to manage the Brexit process with regards to identifying what additional measures organisations have to put in place to take account of the now UK GDPR and our relationship with data subjects around the world, including other countries that are starting to bring in extraterritorial legislation which affect the businesses that I work with. But I'm particularly interested in bias, gender, ethics by design, privacy by design.
Thank you, Helen. Debbie, do you want to give a little bit of introduction to yourself? Also, you may refer to Debbie as the data diva. So do you want to explain a little bit about that?
Sure. Thank you so much. So I'm Debbie Reynolds. I'm the CEO, founder, and Chief Data Privacy Officer of Debbie Reynolds Consulting. I like to tell people I work at the intersection of technology, law, and privacy. My clients are of any size, but I work with companies that have any type of a multinational dimension where they're working with technology. So I work a lot with companies all over the world that have customers all over the world. And I especially work with companies that are working in emerging technology spaces in terms of things like identity systems, technology like facial recognition, things related to virtual reality, anything that you can think of that captures data or information about humans and how that data is being used. I help companies with a strategy and also operationalizing their data privacy programs to create or to prevent barriers to adoption and help them be able to grow in business while also respecting the rights of privacy of individuals.
Thank you, Debbie. And Debbie also does a fantastic blog and audio blog, so do check that out as well. And without further ado, and most certainly not least, because this was in no apparent order whatsoever, we have Yasmin Hinds. Yasmin, do you want to give an introduction to yourself?
Yes, thank you, Dan. So yes, I am a data protection lawyer by profession, and my background is generally being within financial services, which is how I came to meet Dan. And more recently, I've moved into the staffing industry, which actually has been quite enlightening and definitely one of the reasons why I wanted to be involved today. Predominantly my work is around innovation, looking at new products, looking at services, and looking at how we can create better efficiencies around current processes. So a lot of what I do in my day-to-day job involves looking at the various technology that's available now, so not that dissimilar to Debbie, and looking at how we can make sure it's more streamlined, but also using tech as an enabler. And also alongside that, together with the likes of Dan and others, various speaking engagements that we like to endure throughout any given year.
Yes, and I think the correct word there is most certainly endure. Some of them have been at times challenging. So without further ado, let's dive straight in. And one of the first questions is, what on earth is AI? What is artificial intelligence? Who wants to kick me off? Define AI. Emma?
I'm happy to say
Emma.
that, first of all, I have a bit of a problem with that term because it's machines, it's computers performing tasks that humans have told them to fulfill or have taught them to fulfill. And it's about decision making. It's neither artificial or intelligence. It's, it is what it is. But I think this is less a conversation about technology than it is about the data that sits behind the AI, because the power of AI is from the data that feeds it. And so if it's being underpinned by data, the question then follows, what data are we using? How much of it? Is it proportionate? Is it fair? So it's much more helpful, I think, to think about it as a conversation about data. And when, of course, when we're talking about data, we are not just talking about data points on spreadsheets in the cloud. We're talking about ourselves as human beings and how we are treated and how we want the rest of our family, our friends, our loved ones, and our society to be treated. So I think if there's a little bit of a danger in the name, that it somehow distances and we become estranged from the reality that this is really fundamentally about conversations around power, equality, fairness, bias, democracy, government, oppression, all of those things. And yes, the technology is important because it's facilitated by the technology, but I think the questions about the data that underpin AI are actually more important for us to have. So the definition itself, I have a little bit of an issue with. I'm much more interested in the data, but of course I would be because I'm a data regulator.
Helen, I know you've got some fantastic points on this with your recent masters.
Oh,
Do you want to touch on us with ultimately what is AI and machine learning?
Okay, so so when we think of AI, we think of iRobot is what we think of, humanistic, and that's our perception. But of course, AI actually is three different things. It is, as Emma has said, repetitive tasks. How to get a machine, a computer, to do lots and lots of repetitive tasks accurately and speedily, faster than any number of humans could do it. And that is a functionality, but we think of machine learning and then we think of deep learning, and the deep learning concerns us as human beings because we think this is machines making decisions on our behalf. And then you could get yourself down a real rabbit hole, because if a machine takes a decision, who takes responsibility for the impact of that decision? Is it the machine that has to take the responsibility for the impact of that decision, or does the human that programs the AI have to take responsibility for that action? And then if you've made a machine that's got lots of different component parts in it, then do the different people that create those component parts have to take responsibility for the outcome? You can use the story of a toaster. If a toaster, an Internet of Things toaster burns down your house, who's responsible? Is it you for leaving the toaster on, or is it the AI within your toaster that has made it set fire to your kitchen, as opposed to me? There's a history there. So the whole concept of AI is we have to be really clear about what we're talking about. Are we talking about something that where we're just saying sift these data sets and tell me what outcome a human would come up with, or are we asking the technology to learn and make a calculated decision on top of that? And then, as Emma said, those decisions are down to what data you put in and the bias of that data, but also your decision about what outcome you want, because often we do put the cart before the horse. We're telling the AI what we expect of it before it gets going. Yes.
Definitely. Yasmin, what makes AI so particularly dangerous, or with this perception that comes with it? What should we be concerned about with AI and machine learning?
It's a good question. I think there's a misconception around AI. It's my personal view, and a bit of a fear. So it's got this sort of association that it's going to take over the world, and that this AI-powered automation is going to displace jobs and cause this shortage out there in the arena. Well, actually, as Helen's just alluded to, by its virtue, it has many different components. It can be an enabler. It can be used to augment things. It can be used to provide and facilitate processes and systems. So in and of itself, its capabilities are in some ways limited. But I think that it has created this sort of feeling that it's something that you see on television, and in some way it's going to be something that we all adopt to in the 21st century, and it will take over the world. And I think it's clear that we have to be sensible and see it for the benefits that it has. And we also have to take a logical view, and going back to what was said at the start, is that the data that is almost impounded within it is some of the catalysts about what is actually going to be the benefits that we can get out of it. So I see myself and others like yourselves on this panel as being people who can really shape and narrate the messaging that's out there, so that we can perhaps make the language better understood.
Thank you, Yasmin. And obviously, we've seen AI has tremendous benefit. It has the ability to transform the mundane and alleviate labor costs to make it more cost effective and more profitable for organizations. So artificial intelligence has shown to obviously have those benefits. However, through cases such as the Google algorithm and many others, we've seen a showcase of clear discriminatory bias. And for those that are not aware of the Google case, please do look that up. And it relates to image recognition and it identifying women of color to a certain animal rather than as a human, creating a clear bias where it only recognized white individuals 99% accurately, therefore creating discriminatory bias. Does this raise any concerns in the implementation of processing methods such as this? Debbie, what are your thoughts?
Absolutely, Dan. It does raise those questions, especially as the people who are designing these things, they're making associations or allowing the technology to make associations. It may or may not be true. There was an example recently where a algorithm had recognized a turtle as a gun or a rifle. So there are definitely some issues that have to be sorted out there. I'm obviously concerned about issues that could impact humans in negative ways, especially as you said, facial recognition and detection, with a lot of these systems being trained on people with lighter skin and not of darker skin, meaning that a lot of these, the error ratios are, maybe 10 times more on people of color than it would be on someone with a lighter skin. And a lot of that goes back to design of systems and being able to make sure that not only you're looking at diverse people, but also you're working with a spectrum of people who can see maybe the blind spots that some of this technology may have, and also trying to figure out how to use these things in ways where we as humans are not abdicating our responsibility to technology.
Definitely, Debbie. Thank you. Emma, what are your thoughts on the dangers that clearly have been shown with cases like Google?
Well, I was thinking about sort of algorithms and the use of algorithms recently, and what struck me is how difficult it is for most of us to even get beyond the technology that sits around it, because I'm not a technologist. It's so opaque what is happening. And I don't know if any of you have heard of in the US, the red lining that used to go on quite a few decades ago, where they literally had a map and they would put a red line. It's worth looking it up on Wikipedia or anywhere else about in certain areas, sort of labeling of certain areas, mostly poor, mostly Black communities, and they were treated differently. And there's something very sort of visceral about that and deeply offensive, but you can see it. And for those of us who aren't technologists, we can look at that and say that is discrimination, that is bias, that is unacceptable, and you can challenge it. The difficulty I think some of us have, certainly with the non-technologists, is this is so invisible, this activity, and this data, these vast amounts of data that are being fed in, and quite frankly, that we are giving to these organizations all the time by virtue of our tablets and our phones. What is happening to that? How is it happening? And who is making decisions? Those are things that are quite hard to unpick, because it's not like looking at a map when someone has drawn a red line saying that those people were going to treat differently. It's far more difficult to get, to peel back the layers to see what's happening. So I think some of this is about the freedom of information legislation is about encouraging good governance, good conduct, and we all have our opinions about how successful it was. But the principle being that if there is transparency and accountability, there's better decision making, there's better governance, and better outcomes for people. And that sort of lack of any transparency or daylight into some of these processing activities, I think gives us a problem at the very beginning, at the very outset. And often we're often exposed to the reality of what's happening when things go very, very wrong. And that's just too late. And it's something that Hellen, I know, is keen on, is sort of privacy and ethics by design. So we need to move that from being, we just react in the face of a problem where we've seen communities, individuals suffer the harms of this, to building that in from the beginning, going back to Debbie's point of getting everybody in the room who builds these things in the first place has their eyes on the blind spots. Because I really don't think that the technologists on the whole set out to build algorithms and machines that are biased. I don't think there's that malign. I think they don't have enough diversity in that room to get those decisions right at the very outset.
Thank you, definitely. Hellen, do you want to build on that?
So I agree entirely with Emma, and I think that that lots of the conversations that go on about AI are with technologists who love shiny, happy things, and we really enjoy something new and something innovative, but we tend to always look at it down a very, very narrow lens. You know, I have problem A, I get product B to solve problem A, and don't look at the wider consequences. And so we need to have a bigger conversation around what's the accountability, but also about governance and embedding governance within organisations to say that if you're going to take disproportionate action by creating this product that skims too much personal information, then you have to have governance baked into your organization. You have to have somebody who has diverse thinking. You have to have somebody who is willing to ask the difficult questions, both of commercial organizations that have a financial imperative to do whatever they're doing, whether that's to save money or to enter new markets, but also particularly within law enforcement, local authorities, who often do things with the best of intentions. Their procurement is poor. They buy a product and they haven't worked out how that is going to impact. You know, we all know that there is more CCTV in poor areas than there is in rich ones. People of high net worth will have CCTV on their own house, but if you live in a poor neighbourhood, everybody gets surveilled, and there has to be a discussion around that. We also need to recognise how public opinion plays a really significant role in our acceptance of the use of surveillance technologies or not. But the other things that are creeping in, like smart cities, who decides what's smart and for whom? Who is it? You know, we have institutional bias, and we've discussed this at length, which is if you have bias in the physical world, that bias will be led into the digital world if you don't have these conversations, if you don't constantly bring minorities, racial discussion, gender discussion into the way in which you make a decision about the deployment of technology. And we have to have those conversations, but very frequently they're not being had.
Definitely. Thank you, Hellen. And that really ties actually to one of our next questions. Is AI surveillance is spreading at, I think, really an alarming rate. We are seeing organizations, states, and a number of other individuals growing the use of AI. And it's believed to be 75 out of 176 countries globally are actively using artificial intelligence for surveillance purposes. Particularly, over 50 of those are operated by Huawei around the world, which alone is responsible for AI monitoring of those countries. and their citizens, and it's used in their criminal prevention and a number of other things. This company has recently been issued our 5G contract in the UK. Should we be concerned that every call is now being monitored and linked to this AI data? Who wants to kick me off? Debbie?
I will. Yeah, it is concerning. I think, especially with the CCTV, those have been around for decades. But now, because these cameras and these listening devices that we, invite into our homes or we interact with on the street are a lot more sophisticated, and they're also becoming a lot more connected, I think is a concern, especially because when there's indiscriminate data collection, there may be incorrect inferences made about individuals because you have just so much data. So if you think about surveillance, a lot of times we think about a camera on the street, but also we should think about the phones in our pocket, the smart speaker in our house. There are many companies that are using surveillance technologies in work at home applications where, they could be listening to the background of what's happening in your house, also in education. So it really is seeping into almost every crevice of, of life in terms of having devices or having software be able to do the surveillance. The concern is what is happening with that data? How is it being recorded? Is it being used for other purposes? How long will it be retained? Is it transparent to the user what happens with that information? Or are there decisions that are being made about people that they are not aware of that may be harmful to them? So the harm for individuals may be very different. So it's hard to quantify, I think, the harm of these surveillance systems beyond the fact that I think collecting too much data or indiscriminately especially will lead to inferences and connections that may not be true.
Definitely. Thank you, Debbie. Yasmin, do you want to build on that?
Yes, and I'd also like to go back to the point that Helen raised. I loved the line, Helen, when you said that the physical world is almost seeping and transposing into the digital world. And I think it's really important to stress that together with what Debbie's just said, because there's a part of me, and this is obviously talking just from my own experiences, is that I think that what we're experiencing and what we feel almost to be an erosion or an invasion is something that's potentially always existed in one form or another. And I'm not completely convinced that just because we see the tangibleness of it through the data collection and how the data is then maybe used, that could be for a force of good or not, or evil, all we're actually doing is seeing something played out that existed in the physical world. So for instance, I would argue that in some ways surveillance has been good, because, without being too controversial, we've all saw what happened with the George scenario in the US, and technology played its part in that, and was able to contribute to that. There was a whole series back in America, and Debbie, please feel free to challenge me on it, but there was a whole series about 2 years ago, if not even earlier, where we were having to see people who were being shoehorned out of their cars, and really bad things were happening to them. And if it were not for the fact that there was some element of surveillance in and around the area, or their own portability of devices, there was no way of capturing some of that information. So there's an argument to suggest that, yes, it's not great, but there are elements of it that are definitely for good. And I would say, as a woman of color myself, that I would say that all that is done for me, especially in the area that I work, is I'm able to see some of the very clear data collections and the disparities that exist. And I'm able to see that in a much more, sorry, can you see me? My phone just cut off then, apologies. I'm able to see that in a much clearer way than perhaps I could have seen if it was just sort of like an undertone, or it was something that of a feeling, or perhaps something that wasn't tangible for me to touch. In some ways, it's become much more forefront and it's much more visible. And in which case we have to address these things. And that's just only obviously my experience and my own version of events. Happy to be challenged.
Definitely. No, thank you, Yasmin. Go on, Helen.
Sorry, I can say what I thought was really interesting actually was Debbie said we invite the surveillance into our own homes, and so there is this kind of dichotomy that we think of surveillance, we think of it as being state surveillance. You know, Big Brother is watching us. What is the state doing? And there are rules in place for what the state does in its state capacity, but we allow technology that surveils us in order to make money off us into our bedroom and into our children's bedrooms and on our phone and tracked us where we go. I mean, Google Maps at the moment is very happily telling me every month that I've gone 3 miles from my house. It's really depressing, but you know, hey ho. But equally stalkerware, stalkerware, it is surveillance tools. It's that you know, abusive partners put on their victims' phones so that they can track and chase them wherever they go. Even tools like Apple's 360 Life is as a surveillance tool, and we need to have a broader discussion, because when we think of surveillance, as Yasmin has explained, there are many societal goods for being able to see when things have happened, to put evidence in place, to protect individuals. There are clear reasons for processing that data. I don't have a problem with processing that data. I have a problem when a school puts a CCTV camera in a girl's toilet as a surveillance tool. But we still have to have a discussion about how much is not enough, and we have to bring into this discussion commercial organisations that create surveillance tools, and we need to call it surveillance, because it's a much more visceral reaction than if you say Google Mapping or look, or you know, track your child or those kind of things. And when I work with companies, when they say they're doing X, Y, and Z, I say, that's surveillance. They go, no, it's not. I'm just tracking them on their whatever. You go, no, it's surveillance. And let's use that word outside the law enforcement context, because it's a much broader discussion than we're currently having.
Definitely, Helen. Thank you. And do you know what? That ties very nicely, actually, to one of the other questions. Is liberal democracies are the major use from research of AI surveillance. We've seen cases such as the Los Angeles police using body cameras for mapping individuals' faces against the record of criminals, whether they have any reason to do so. It's just done automatically. They may not even have any suspicion or reason to check whether you're a criminal, but it's done automatically because they're just wearing a camera. You're also seeing surveillance systems such as in China, which is measuring actually a happiness metric, which actually allows them to check whether you're of a certain level of happiness, and then you can't go to certain places in the cities. So the index shows 51% of advanced democracies deploy AI surveillance, in contrast to only 37% of closed autocratic states. Where does the divide between protecting the state, so security, and privacy take place? When is protecting the state an erosion and an erasion of our freedoms and liberties?
I'll jump in. I think the point where it is an erosion is that some of this data collection is divorced from purpose. So not being able to really tie it to a purpose, especially over a long-term period of time, is a huge problem with data collection. I know before the call, I used this analogy with you guys, which was, if you want to find a needle in a haystack, you don't create bigger haystacks. So if, for example, the example you gave of the police officer using facial recognition to capture someone's face to see if they're a criminal or have some type of criminal background, if the person is found that they weren't a criminal, that data probably still gets stored somewhere, and for what purpose? So being able to try to tie this data back to purpose is really important. This is an issue that we have a lot, or a conversation that we're having a lot in the US, as we are having more laws like the CCPA being passed, where they're trying to tie data collection to a purpose, where unfortunately a lot of the data collection, especially in surveillance, is just happening indiscriminately and being stored, for long terms, period of time, for really no purpose, and being able to sort of purge that information if it's no longer needed or if it's not actionable is very important.
Thank you, Debbie. And for the benefit of our attendees, the CCPA stands for the California Consumer Protection Act and is the Californian version, or similar to that, of GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, which you can find in Europe. Emma, Helen, or Yasmin, who wants to chip in on that one next?
Just got for a couple of very small points, if I may. I think it's really important to make a distinction between democracies and those countries that don't have that sort of governance, that sort of accountability. And I think there's a danger that privacy professionals and data protection professionals get pitted against things like surveillance and CCTV as a matter of principle. And I think that's what's wrong, because I think, as a couple of other speakers have already said, I think it's an important point that Yasmin made, that some of the surveillance can be a public good. I think the question is there good cause for the subpoena? What is it there to do? What is the outcome that you're after? Is it targeted, and is it proportionate? And is the way that the data that sit behind it, is that are the data used legitimately? Is there governance? Is there purpose restriction? Again, that's something Debbie mentioned. So these are really important pillars. And it's neither good or bad of itself, surveillance and AI. It's who's making the decisions and what is happening as a result of those decisions that we really need to start to consider. So I think that it's important not to demonize the technology and what sits around it as a matter of principle, but it's important to peel back some of the questions around where the power actually sits in terms of decision making and outcomes.
Thank you. Helen.
Yeah, I think also I think sometimes in the legislative discussion, because there are various cases. There's a case called Class v. Ors in Germany, where it was actually examined whether the state was right to use the surveillance tools it was using. But I think there's a missing bit is that we don't examine what society thinks is proportional. So we often have the discussion about what people will accept and won't accept is made by a very small number of individuals, and their bias seeps into this discussion. And so we need to have a clearer conversation and examination of what risks society are willing to take. Some people will say, we are surrounded by people who mean us harm, and therefore everybody must be watched wherever they go. And other people who say, I don't do anything wrong, don't treat me like I am a criminal all the time everywhere I go. But we have to have a really frank discussion about what society is the right thing to do. And one example of this is actually the Track and Trace app from the NHS, where individuals were saying, you've got to download it, you've got to do it, you've got to use this app, you've got to do it because it's for society's good. And other people saying, I don't want the state to know where I am or where I've been. I mean, we now know that the QR code didn't work all that well, and etc. etc. But the state's surveilling me, seeing where I'm going, but I don't want them to know where I've been. And other people saying, but it's for the common good. I need to know if you've been in contact with my granny. So that just shows that the real push and pull of deciding the deployment of these kind of technologies. But once again, we don't have that discussion about the stuff we put in our home. So but it's got to be a very rounded debate and discussion about what we think what's our red line. Where is too far, and we don't have that enough.
I think I'm always concerned about, I guess that one part is the data collection, obviously, that we're talking about, but what is the action that happens as a result of this data collection. So an example I would give to this is there was a gentleman in the US who was arrested for, he was suspected of stealing something from a home. And actually the police didn't have any evidence that he was actually in the home. All they had was his GPS location on his phone, that he had walked past this house or home on a particular day, and found out that this was kind of his regular pattern of walking back and forth, like to his job or whatever. And he actually was arrested and had to disprove that he did not actually burgle his home. And they admitted that the technology in terms of the GPS could not really place him on the property or inside the property, but they said just because he was close to it, it was enough for them to arrest him. So these are some of the harms that I think happen with surveillance, where we're, again, some people are abdicating their human responsibility by trying to have the surveillance apparatus or software tell them what they think is right.
Definitely. I think
oh,
it's an interesting area. Please go on, Yasmin.
I would agree with you, but I think something that I heard it said at the start of your question, but I think at the underlying factor for me remains that what is the element of transparency in a lot of it. So for the things that we can manage as individuals, the things that we do agree to, so the apps that we perhaps decide to accept and agree to, is the transparency about an understanding about what we're actually signing up to. People aren't reading the verbiage, they're not reading the small print. We know that legislation is trying to encourage, and regulators are trying to encourage us to use terminology and language where people are informed, and often that is still missed. But yet we can go through great lengths through marketing campaigns, etc., to sell generic products out there in the market, and people understand what its purpose is, what it benefits that it has for them, what disadvantages it has, yet we don't have the same, as Helen referred to, when it comes to these types of apps. So for me, that's still a big sticking point. And the other thing would be around the fact that there are cultural differences that have been said earlier. You know, having been someone who actually, you know, I went to China at one point, I'm very aware culturally, you know, it's a very different type of organization. And similarly, I would say that exists within even employment structures and companies within which people work. What element of real consent or real acceptance do people have to having either covert or overt surveillance in those types of environments? Is it a case of, well, you have a job or you don't have a job if you choose not to put the camera on? You know, at what point does that stop? So I think, as it's been alluded by all the panelists, there's a much broader discussion, and there are many nuances that we'd have to really dissect. But I think the overriding fact, as it's been said, is that the common good and the need to use it in a way which is purposeful and has some limitation and has some lawfulness to it is really important.
Definitely, Yasmin. I think it's really interesting, and obviously artificial intelligence is a broad area. How do we prevent and avoid physical bias in digital arenas? Helen?
We have to diversify the conversation, and we have to be, you know, we have to put our big boy pants on and admit that much of our legal framework and our technology has been created by men. And so voices, you know, very strong voices like Emma and Debbie and Yasmin and others in the field, we have to be standing up and saying, can we have this conversation? Can we discuss whether this impacts a particular demographic in a particular way? Is the outcome for those individuals the outcome that you want for society as a whole? If the outcome for those individuals is not good, then then we have to change things. And one very interesting example, AI is used a lot with voice recognition. I don't know about anybody who's got a car that relies on voice recognition. If you're a woman, try using your voice recognition in your car. because it doesn't work, and it's proven that it doesn't work. But if you shout or you make like a boy, then you can make your voice recognition work, because it's been trained on male voices. And so with these discussions, we need to state not only who are we including in the outcome that is being disproportionately included in that outcome because of bias that's in the data that's being fed into the systems, but also who are we excluding by the design of the technology that we have created. And but we've got to be really strong and have those conversations. And regulation, I am a big fan of the GDPR. I like it a lot. But the online harms white paper has shown how difficult it is to regulate in an online environment, in a technology environment, in a way that covers all the bases. And I think we need to have a much broader conversation about who gets brought into the framework of regulation. It might not be the business, it might be the purpose that gets brought in. And within, just as privacy by design default is brought into GDPR by law, then we may have to bring in ethics by design and some form of legislative governance to make sure those questions are asked, and as Emma has alluded to very clearly, accountability.
Definitely, and it comes down to the age-old item of the fundamentals really in all of the privacy laws around the world of being processing for a set purpose and be clear with what you're trying to achieve, not just processing a bit of everything and then decide afterwards.
Can I make a point, please, Dan?
Go for it, please.
The one thing that strikes me in conversations around data more generally is that we're not very good at understanding and articulating the harm, because we think of data as something sitting on a database or in a cloud somewhere. I think we need to change that really quite dramatically, because harms are outcomes of election. Harms are whether or not somebody is able to access services. Harms are which president gets in the US. I mean, this is the reality of the way that data is being manipulated and used. So we need to start looking at the way data are processed through the lens of really understanding the impact. Because I think before it's like, oh, we get a bit of extra marketing, get a few emails, advertising, vouchers. That's not where we are anymore. We are about on the mass manipulation, even of democracies. So I think understanding data harms means that we move from a conversation of, if the technology can do it, let's just do it, to the conversation of, well, the technology can do it, but do we want it to do it? Or do we want it to do it slightly differently, looking through the ethical lens and shifting it? And no other area of our lives where there are harms as potential outcomes do we allow this sort of free-for-all with no speed checks. So even the vaccine rollout, we want the regulator to check it. We want them to understand what risks we're all taking. You know, cars don't just get rolled out and drive at any speed. There are checks and balances, and that's not just to inhibit our freedoms, it's to protect us as well. And I think some of those conversations need to be a bit wiser. Now we understand what data harms actually look like in this digital era.
Wonderful. Thank you, Emma. And that really now leads us on to our question time. It sounds like welcome to the story of Balamory there for a second. So if you do have any question, please do message Cinna, and we will try to get to as many as possible. The first question is from Janet Berridge, who is our former past chair. Janet, do you want to ask us your question?
Yes, certainly. Thank you, Dan. Good evening, ladies, and thank you for a very comprehensive overview of the subject. What I was asking has sort of been covered, but I want to explain the reason why I was going to ask whether you feel that images from CCTV are an invasion of privacy or not. And the reason I ask this is I now live in Berlin, in Germany. And when we were in the throes of moving, a very kind friend of ours from England came over. He's a master carpenter, and because he was going to do some work for us in the house. And we took him around Berlin and showed him around and everything. And at one point, I remember he kept looking up all the time, turning his head this way and that. And I said, "What are you looking for?" And he said, the cameras. There aren't many cameras here. And he really noticed the difference between London and Berlin. And he said, you're not surveilled here like we are in London. And when I thought about it, having lived in London myself, I thought, yes, he's got a point there. So the Germans haven't got the same level of surveillance. There are far fewer cameras. I mean, they do use it where they feel it's necessary. But do you think that the UK has gone further towards the American model? And do you think there is a danger of it just taking over and, as you've indicated, not being properly controlled?
Thank you, Janet.
I'll just jump in if I may, just from a regulatory perspective. I mean, clearly we're not in the UK with Channel Islands, but it's one of the areas we get the most complaints about, because I think it's become so easy to buy a camera. You can go to B&Q and other shops are available and literally just buy it. But by the same token, this is a camera as well. So it makes no sense from a legal perspective to differentiate between something you can stick on a wall and something I can just carry around. So I think if I may just plead the regulator's point for a minute, is that I think the answer is yes, it has huge privacy and social implications to feel constantly surveyed. But quite what we do about it without straying into the domestic realm of an individual who says, oh, my car's been vandalized 3 nights in a row and I just want to put a camera up to catch the guys that did it. I mean, that's a legitimate concern. So you're stuck between the devil and deep blue sea as a regulator. So I think it does need a broader conversation, but it points to really interesting cultural differences and what we accept and what becomes normalized. Even if we object at the beginning, we might end up going, oh, well, everyone's doing it, so we may as well. But I think it raises really important questions.
Thank you, Emma. Does any of the speakers want to add to that? Yasmin?
I also thought, oh, sorry, Debbie.
Oh, go ahead. Yes.
I was also, when you were talking, I think everything that's just been said by Emma, but also for me, there's this wider badging of public interest and this justification that it's needed for the wider national security. But I think what comes with that is the fact that we don't necessarily have the justification or the rationale. And when trying to obtain that, it's not readily accessible. So yes, I think there's an element where we could question, is there actually a purpose for that, and do we go too far in that collection? But I think that the general sort of response in London anyway, or the UK, would be yes, it's to protect the wider public. I don't know if Debbie has a different view.
Yeah, I have a slightly different view, and this is based on me being a technologist and understanding how the technology works. The way the CCTV used to work was it was not an intelligent camera. It was just a camera that recorded information that was happening in real time. The problem now with the technology with CCTV is now it is connected to databases and connected to AI. So it can be an invasion of privacy if, let's say, you're walking in a public place, and that's a place where you wouldn't expect to have privacy, but it's capturing your face and your image, and it's maybe going back to databases to find out additional information about you from other data sources. So I think that is a invasion of privacy, and it's hard to, from a purpose perspective, to rationalize why that is important if you're just walking down the street to get milk from the grocery store.
Thank you, Debbie. And I think just to build on that question, just very, very, very quickly from Emma as a regulator, what can people do if they have concerns, if they think, oh, I've been recorded, or what is their recourse there?
It's so difficult. I mean, there is no silver bullet, and if there was a silver bullet, the law, it wouldn't be welcomed, because you can't say it's always allowed or it's always prohibited. What we've tried to do, certainly in our small office, is make a list of the considerations. So what is the CCTV data being collected for? What is the individual that's collecting it then doing with it? So, for example, are they just keeping it to make sure that someone doesn't vandalize their car, or are they live streaming it, or are they making it excerpts and then pushing it out on a social media platform? So again, trying to understand the reason for the collection, what is happening behind the scenes with the data, and importantly, the impact on the individual whose data are being collected. So we consider all those things. It's very difficult territory for a regulator to get into when someone's got it on their domestic premises, start determining how they should be handling that data, because you are in, at least arguably, household domestic purposes exemption territory, and you see regulators across the globe grappling with this. But the principle is, if it's a regulator, you're going to say that I regulate you as the 98-year-old who's just trying to protect their car, who is not processing any other data, then why aren't we regulating these when people walk down the street? Because cars have them, the motorbikes, I don't know about wherever you are, but they see them a lot with on their helmets, the GoPros. It's the same thing. So as a regulator, you can't just say, I choose that just because the optics are nice for the public. You've got to address the broader question, and that is not easy. But the fact that it's not easy doesn't mean we just wring our hands and walk away. The fact that it's not easy means we have these discussions and try and get to some sort of resolution. But there is no silver bullet for this, but I think it even more highlights the importance of discussing it and talking about it.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Thank you, Emma. We have a question from Semra, who is a committee member for the Defence and Security Circle. Semra, do you want to ask your question? Let me
Can you hear me?
on mute. There you go.
Okay, thank you very much for the informative talks. A very short question. As the surveillance is about social justice and as gender equality is about social justice, can we say surveillance is feminist?
Ooh. No.
Good question. I will say no.
No, I agree with you.
Well, one thing I will say that's very important for people to understand about technology, and this goes back to artificial intelligence, machine learning, AI, the things that we see and we interact with in terms of technology are different for each of us. So a lot of us have the impression that we see all the same things or we experience all the same things. I think Hellen made a really good example about using voice detection in a car and how it's different for a man as opposed to a woman. Think of the internet that way. Think of the way AI works in that way. So some of us, our interactions with these things are very different. So I would say no, that they aren't. I wouldn't think of them as feminists, but I think, people who have less friction in the world may say, well, what is everyone complaining about? Because I don't have these problems. But if these systems are designed by people who are like you, obviously you would probably have less friction than other people, whether that be women, people of color, or people in different socioeconomic situations may experience those things in a different way. So I think it's important or incumbent upon us to realize that we're all experiencing these things in different ways, so that we don't ignore the harms of other people just because we may not be experiencing them ourselves.
So I would agree with Debbie very much that I wouldn't say that surveillance was actually for social justice. There are many, many instances of surveillance, which is the very antithesis of social justice. We always have to look at this through the frame of technology is not gender neutral. And to give you some idea of quite how ungender neutral technology is, even Wikipedia has been found to be to have some very its language about women is very different to its language about men, and we think of Wikipedia as being quite just our neutral lookbook, don't we? But academic research has discovered that it very much isn't. So I would have to argue that surveillance is probably in its current state is very anti-feminist, particularly when you think about where a lot of surveillance is used. If we bring into that description stalkerware and AI use in cars and where surveillance is often put then it very much isn't. But it's a brilliant question because it makes us consider that point and to have that discussion.
Definitely, thank you. We have a question from Dr. Andrea Elena. I might be pronouncing your name incorrectly there. On the matter of inviting surveillance into our homes or private lives, might education not be a path towards a more mature approach to ensuring and allowing the use of tech by individuals to prevent long-term social harm? What do we think?
I agree with that. I think of technology or surveillance as a knife that cuts both ways. So obviously there are benefits there, but then there are downsides and harms. So I think having things be more transparent and easily understandable, it helps the individual to make a educated or informed decision about what types of technology they want to be able to use in their homes. So I think Amazon is creating a drone, well, actually have two different drone programs I think is interesting. One is they want to be able to have drones deliver packages, which I'm okay with. But then also they're developing drones that can fly around inside of your house, which I'm not okay with. So I think being able to figure out what makes the most sense and not just look at the benefits, look at the downsides. You know, one thing I tell people to do is not to have smart speakers in areas where they're working and they're working on confidential information, because if the speakers are picking up that information, you literally no longer own that information. You shared it with, you know, whoever or whatever technology that you're using, and that's a concern. And then also people having smart speakers in their children's rooms, because hackers can hack into that and actually be communicating with people you don't even know. So you really have to look deeply and figure out, does the benefit outweigh the harm?
Definitely.
May I,
Thank you,
Dan?
Debbie. Please go for it.
I think it's a really good question, and we're only a tiny office in a small island, but we do a lot of work with schools to help educate and give digital skills to kids right from the beginning. I think it's so important. But I think the important point to make here, in my personal view, is that individuals may benefit from being on Facebook, for example, but collectively we are all the worse for it, I think. So to educate individuals about what a 6-year-old or a 10-year-old or a 13-year-old about what the greater harms may be around election manipulation or disenfranchising a certain section of the community, it won't resonate, because individually they can talk to their friends, they can share photos, they can chat, they can do all things that as an individual. And we're actually mostly pretty selfish as human beings. I think that if we benefit, then we want it to continue, but we have to encourage a broader conversation, which that I think it's about education. Yes, of course, empowering individual, but importantly, we need to get these guys in check, the guys that have all this data, because at the minute we look at the state and we wring our hands about how powerful the state is and the data they're collecting, but at least there is some accountability around that we can trigger if we want to in a democracy. But what about the big tech giants? Where is the accountability there of the impacts and the data harms, not just for today, but for tomorrow and for the next 10 years, next 20 years. So education is only a part, it's an important part, but it is only a part of the picture.
I think,
sorry, carry on, Yasmin.
I think I really want to reinforce that and say absolutely, because the first thing, as Debbie was talking, was around generations for me, and having a family of my own, I can speak from experience, and I think that the generations are such, the younger generations, or certainly from the millenniums down, their view is it's accessible, it's easy, everybody's doing it, and so it's part of the norm. And if I think of, you know, things such as TikTok, so, you know, he isn't aware, my children are not aware of things that are being trapped in the background, things and features that are available by using and uploading these videos. And that's only one example, but trying to make them understand the consequences of that. I think an awful lot of the accountability, as Emma has said, needs to come from these companies. And they need to be held accountable for what they are doing, because in some instances, this has resulted in death and suicides and really traumatic things. So there has to be some governance, and somebody has to hold them accountable. I'm not suggesting, Emma, that you have to as a regulator, but I think broadly, either we take and collective responsibility, including parents and those within lines of authority, or we do it on a wider level at a government level?
I think it also brings this also to sharp relief. You know, I have teenage and slightly older children, and trying to get them to do what they want to do in a user-friendly way, or stopping them from doing things is really quite hard, because we like instant gratification. So am I going to read the actual fact what's going on when, you know, I don't read the ingredients on a Mars bar if I want to eat a Mars bar, do I? You know, and that's the same kind of thing with tech. You know, my friends have all got TikTok, so I'm gonna get TikTok, and my mum says I can't have it. Well, I'll just download it anyway, and she'll find out when she finds out. So we can't put we need to educate that there are things that you need to look beyond, but we're all savvy, clever people, and it's complicated. And I spend most of my time turning things off because I don't understand what I don't understand. I'm not willing to participate in. But I've lost the battle of the smart speakers in my house. So, you know, I've just had to kind of just go with it and let them swear at the smart speakers. So that's fine. So, but we can't put the responsibility on the individual if the individual isn't told in a way that they can understand and quickly. And it's got to be quick. It's got to be 2 sentences or less, you know, for you to understand. Otherwise, it's useless. However, we also can't say to the technology firms, we want you to create products that the UK says is fine in our market, because this is what we want in our market, and this is how our society behaves. And could you create your product to kind of make society behave the way in which our current government thinks you should behave? So you're caught totally between these two stools. Education plays a little part, but and regulation plays a part, but it's a much more holistic conversation than we've been having about how to ensure that we look after the individuals in society who cannot access the information that tells them what is happening with their data and what effect that is having on their life.
I think the key bit there is it comes down to the principle that overrides many things of transparency, being clear. We have a question here from Dishant around how do you regulate to prevent hackers using your information for blackmail purposes?
I suppose as the regulator in the room, I mean, how do you regulate to stop any criminal behaviour? I think you've got to have a robust enforcement regime in place and appropriate penalties, and give individuals the tools to protect their own property, including data, and have an enforcement regime that is able and willing to respond swiftly. That's really, really tough in the cyber world, because it's not like getting your house burgled and you've got some forensics literally on the doorstep and you can track that and the policeman can look at that. This is really, really difficult for regulators. And I think that there are some conversations that need to be global, and the GDPR is the nearest we have to that. So I know from my personal experience, if we're dealing with a cross-jurisdiction issue with another EU member state, it's a much easier conversation. It's very tricky out with that. And let's face it, a lot of the criminal activity is happening in far-flung places. So a great question. And I wish I had an answer, quite frankly, because if I did, I would write the regulation that would stop those guys doing that. But I think it's everybody playing their parts. I mean, when I'm online banking now, I was dragged kicking and screaming. But if I set up a new payee, then I get an alert saying, is this what you want? Are you sure? Is this definitely you? So the bank playing its part, me playing my part in better understanding the risks I face, the technology playing its part to look after me and send me alerts if things look a bit strange. So I think it's a bit of a cop out probably to say it, but I think we have a role. Regulators absolutely have a role. The public have a role. Industry have a role. Government has a role. And lobby groups and organisations like yourselves to keep that conversation going have a role as well.
Definitely, and I think it's a hard one. And how do you keep yourself safe? I suppose is general advice is obviously make sure your computer is up to date. Install your updates. Have that information security view of have antivirus installed on your computer. reduce your cookies, so you can, within your settings on Google and others in Chrome and Internet Explorer, every time you close a session, you can tell it to clear your cookies automatically. The best thing you can do is trying to protect yourself, and remember, all of the information that you put out there is what they use. These hackers are not, and these people that try and steal your identity are not rifling through your bins, as you may have thought many years ago. They are 9 times out of 10 collecting this information from your Facebook, your LinkedIn, because you have put the information out there, and from other places. So just be conscious of the information you post, and remember,
Sorry, can I just
it is out
really
there. Go for it, Emma.
Quickly, sorry I feel so really
No,
interrupted.
please.
It's so difficult on Zoom, but the point, one of the most important points we'd like to tell any individual in our jurisdictions is your data has value. So you walk around with your wallet with money in it. We use money anymore, do we? But if you had a gold bar that was yours, you wouldn't just ignore what you did with it and not look after it. Your data is so valuable. There's entire business models now built around data. It's the most valuable non-consumable asset most organizations own. So if we can start encouraging the community to start recognizing their data has value. So these pop-ups, we want to take your data and use it for whatever we want. Are you happy with that? Maybe the answer is no. And maybe we need to be a bit more savvy about the organizations that we trust our data with. There are brands, there are high street brands that I trust. If I want some advice about if my daughter's got a headache, what's the best painkiller? There are brands that I know that I trust as a consumer. So we need privacy and data governance to be part of that consumer branding as well, so it becomes a commercial imperative as well as an ethical one.
Definitely.
And would you, and Emma, would you accept, and Dan, would you accept that? I think, isn't there an element, again, sorry, I have to go back to accountability for organizations. So I'm thinking here of Instagram, and I'm thinking particularly in terms of the fact that there's a number of people who, especially through COVID, who have set up online shops, and there has been numerous amounts of data which has come exposed where they have been ransomware and hacking of individual accounts, and these are people's livelihoods, so they need it, they need access to it. They're being held to ransom over it, and in some cases money has changed hands. They're being told by certain organizations, well, you should have used two-way factor authentication, etc., etc. But actually what they found was that once they got regulators involved, once they got their MPs involved, suddenly likes of people like Instagram, and they're not the only ones, were suddenly able to retrieve their accounts. So I have to question and wonder how much really they can do, and how much are they doing in their space.
I couldn't agree more. I couldn't agree more. And I don't know if anyone listens to Moneybox on Radio 4, but it tends to be these poor people ringing in with issues. And as soon as Moneybox gets involved, it gets resolved. And I think it saddens me as a regulator. And I see that part of our job is to almost shame organizations, encourage them to do the right thing, but shame them. And so this shouldn't be how you behave when you just think you're being watched. It should be how you behave all the time, which is an ethical business model. And I think the more that people like all of us demand that and don't accept anything less, the more, I mean, that's where culture change comes in. But no, you're absolutely right. It's been an appalling situation. And I heard a story about one the other day who lost everything in amongst all the pandemic, and it's just grim. And I think that's where the platforms, however well educated you are as an individual, as a small business, you need the help of the platforms to help you navigate it and to help you rescue a situation which you find yourself in that's that catastrophic. And they just don't sometimes, and it's unacceptable.
And I think also as well that we need to create mechanisms where those that know, and so the tech savvy people can raise issues and in a manner where they'll be taken notice of, because it's, you know, we talk a lot about regulating surveillance and data and etc. And there was a criticism that if you can't make the regulator listen, and you can't have action, or it isn't easy to complain to Instagram and have in a way that feeds it through to the regulator, so that there is this transparent way. And this is where AI could probably come in really handy in terms of being able to spot the serious complaints and the pattern of complaints, and rather than the people who are just making trouble for trouble's sake, to be able to spot the trends analysis so that they can pinpoint businesses that are not behaving well. And for instance, a very well-known consumer company that came across my radar a few weeks ago, I had to click 47 times to get rid of their cookies because I wanted to go onto their site without down any. And when I challenged them about it, they said, oh, it's okay. And I go, no, it isn't okay. I don't want any of your cookies. And every time I come onto your website, I've got to click 47 times to turn them all off. That's not good customer experience. In actual fact, what that means is the second time someone comes onto your site, they're just going to tick okay to all, because they can't, because you have a service that the people that come to you are going to want to use because of its very nature. And you've made it so that in actual fact, it's imperative that they accept all of your surveillance tools in order to be able to access your service. I, as somebody who's in the know, should be able to report the fact that they've got a non-compliant cookie banner. And then that should be picked up, and AI should be able to sift that through and tell the regulator, had more than one complaint, very specific complaint about this, rather than just a free-form form where they say, oh, we're just collecting data for statistical reasons. So we have to get sophisticated about enabling reporting to force good behavior, and GDPR does it in a really clever way. GDPR creates up and down compliance, because if you're a compliant processor, you will force your controller to do the right thing. If you're a compliant controller, you won't work with processors who aren't compliant, and that has done it over the last 2.5 years. That has really sifted some of the wheat from the chaff, and now when you present someone with a contract but they've never had one before, you can immediately work out who the good and bad actors are, and you can make a good purchasing decision. And we have to create that environment for consumers who use technology.
Definitely. Thank you, Helen. I think that's a really key point. We are up to our time, but I'm aware we've got a question from a key member. Is Alta, who is the Tasmanian Presidential Office and is the chair of the Aga Khan Economic Planning Committee in the East Africa. Do we believe AI is dispensable? Hence they big tech get away without accountability. Do you believe AI is dispensable, and are big techs accountable, I suppose, is the question.
Shall I jump in?
Go for it.
I don't think you can reverse some of the progress that we're making technologically. I think that we just need to have a little better checks and balances and how we use it, and the fact that technologically, I said this before, that it can be done, this doesn't necessarily mean it should be, and that we often put, in fact, nearly all aspects of our lives, we have processes and procedures to check that it's going to do what we want it to do and it's not going to harm people. For some reason, AI seems to be sitting outside of that. So I think it's probably more, from my perspective, more important to put it into that process rather than think we can get rid of it completely. I think AI has huge opportunities around health, to do screening, to do the stuff that the eyeballing of thousands and thousands of images to see if there's any medical intervention needed. That's phenomenal. So again, let's not pit privacy pros against progress, but let's do it in a way, I often say this, let's build our community and our culture and our society on human values, not on the exploitation of them. And that can be done with AI, it can be done with big data, but it tends not to be at the minute. So I think we just need to take a moment to reflect where we are and reposition the trajectory that we're on. And it can be done. If there's ever a time in these last 12 months that we've seen what humanity is capable of in the face of extraordinary situation, it's been now. So we can do these things, but we need a momentum to be built. And that is sometimes tricky when the harms are so opaque and the processing activities are so opaque. It's not harm right in front of you and people are dying in front of you in the streets. It's over there, so it's easy to ignore. But I think the time has come where the ignoring needs to stop, and we need to the collective action, really. So was there a second part of the question? Sorry, I forgot.
And I suppose it's, are big companies accountable?
Well, I think I've made my views probably quite clear on some of those tech platforms. I think that one of the biggest, almost an existential problem we have is a complete lack of accountability, and I'll probably leave it there.
Definitely. We do have one question, which I do want to make time for, is Sinna, who is very kindly working in the background. Sinna, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, sure. I know we're short on time, so I'll hurry it up. So we see across the Commonwealth the pre-deployment of smart cities and surveillance being a big part of that. What are the concerns regarding frontier markets and potential high populous economies adopting these technologies without thorough regulation? Thank you.
Go ahead.
No, carry on, Debbie. I'll help you.
I think it's a big concern, especially as the technology is getting more sophisticated, and a lot of these smart city initiatives, because a lot of times they're collecting data, or the technologies that are being implemented are collecting data from various data sources, and then they're kind of knitting that information together. So in the future, they want to be able to have real time, let's say there's a threat or something, they'll have a real time information, not just the image of someone, not just the GPS of them, but possibly, satellite imagery, possibly information about reports, possibly information about the history of the person, and being able to do that in a more rapid fashion is something that I think I see happening with people who are implementing technology that will be used in smart cities. I think it's important or incumbent upon individuals to get as educated as possible, and then we have to put pressure on companies, possibly through regulation, maybe some shaming, to be more transparent with how this is happening and then what happens to that data in the future. So I don't think that we can stop this. I think we just have to find out what's happening, make sure things are transparent, and make sure that things are, these organizations are being held to account and individuals' harms are being evaluated.
So for me, the biggest issue with smart cities and the initiatives is the who's making the decision about what is being monitored, what they want to change, and what the outcome they want is, and are they looking at that in terms of the impact on the individual, and which individual? Do they have in mind a carbon copy of themselves, and that they want to create a lifestyle and a balance for a clone of themselves? And that's always a danger with these things. With smart cities, how are they going to monetize any of the data that they collect? We already know from some of the open data initiatives that if you allow access to numerous databases to a single organization, they will layer it on top of one another, and you get unforeseen outcomes, where you can actually identify not only individuals, but you can identify whether they're on medication, what kind of car they drive, how many children they have, their educational levels. So I think that they're often, the initiatives are started with the best of intentions, i.e. better energy use, better transport systems, but looking beyond the framework of that is really important. And I would say it is an area where there would be some kind of regulation, because if it's got a real community basis, then does the community owns that data, and the community gets to say what happens with that data, who has access to it. And my final worry about smart cities is who decides where they go, who decides what community should be part and parcel of what is a large-scale surveillance. And is it ubiquitous, is it universal, or are you just targeting particular neighbourhoods? And you might say it's a low-income neighbourhood, and therefore we can save the residents there money, we can get them from A to B quicker, because if we put this system in. But then you're boxing those people off into the outcome that you've decided that they require. And there has to be a lot more dialogue around those implementations of those kind of technologies.
Thank you, Helen. And I'm afraid we are out of time. Thank you all for your very insightful talks, topics, and questions. They have been incredibly useful. And thank you for giving your time, for giving us some really insightful insight into AI and some of the dangers that we have in our modern society in relations to this technology, and also some of the challenges that we can see, and practical hints and tips which hopefully we can all take away and learn from. It has been a pleasure to hear from you. This meeting has been recorded, so in the week it will be on our YouTube, and you can also connect with our speakers on LinkedIn. It has been a pleasure speaking with you and being your host. I'll now pass you over to Jennifer, who is going to give our closing talk. Thank you, Jennifer.
Thank you, Dan, and I echo the words of your closing, as it's been truly a remarkable evening. So with that, chairs, fellow members, and esteemed guests, on behalf of the National Liberal Club, I'm delighted to have the opportunity to thank Emma Martins, Hellen Beveridge, Debbie Reynolds, and Yasmin Hinds for joining us this evening, and for what we can all agree has been a thought-provoking discussion, which will certainly resonate for days to come. This evening's event brought together 4 experts in their field to discuss privacy, surveillance, data, and the challenges the relationship of the 3 present to industry, organization, and government. We also explored the challenges as well as the pitfalls in assuming we have the answers to the problems we face, and recognize that these are no different in the Channel Islands to those faced in Britain and mainland Europe and the United States. Tonight is also a great example of 2 NLC groups working together to host an event which has vast appeal, both within the NLC and beyond our membership across demographics. Thank you again to Emma, Hellen, Debbie, and Yasmin for joining us this evening, and I hope we will have the opportunity to welcome you into the club in the future as lockdown and life permits. Also, a quick reminder that as Dan said, that a recording of this talk will be available in the coming days on the NLC's YouTube channel, and please do join us for our next event at 6 p.m. on the 19th of April, after the last parade, veterans making their way, with Lynn O'Donnell in conversation with Commander Kay Holsworth. Thank you again to everyone for coming, to Val and the Women's Circle for co-hosting, and many thanks to Noel and Dan for arranging. I look forward to seeing everybody at our upcoming event, if not sooner. Have a good evening and stay safe.